Hi, I want to welcome you and thank you for streaming this message today. I'm really glad that you joined us. At Bailey Christian Church, it matters to us that you feel welcomed, like that this is family. Whether you're young or not so young, my hope is that you'll encounter Jesus, and that as you encounter Jesus, you'll find encouragement to live a life of faith for Him. If you're new with us today, I would love if you wouldn't mind filling out the Connect card that is linked here, or going to baileychristianchurch.com and letting us know who you are, if you have any questions that we can follow up with, or even if you have a prayer concern and you'd like somebody to pray for you, we'd love to know so that we can connect with you. If you're in the area sometime, in the Bailey area, we'd love to have you join us in person. And the reason I invite you into that is because we're called not just to experience a message, but actually to live a life of faith in the context of community. And so we'd love for you to be a part of what's happening here at Bailey. And if you want to know more about how you can get plugged in to what's happening here, again, go back to baileychristianchurch.com, check things out, and if we can help you, we would love to follow up with you as well. I hope today that you're blessed through this message. Back to the Thanksgiving portion of things. It's kind of an interesting. I didn't plan it this way, so we'll give God the glory for this. The particular passage we're looking at in Exodus is really kind of the opposite of Thanksgiving. They're complaining and grumbling. And I was looking up some information just about the importance of Thanksgiving, and there was an article written. It said that more and more researchers are finding that gratitude doesn't just make you feel like a better person, it actually is good for your health. Professor and researcher Robert A. Emmons puts it this way: clinical trials indicate that the practice of gratitude can have dramatic and lasting effects in a person's life. It can lower blood pressure, it can improve immune function and facilitate more efficient sleep. But not only that, a University of California, San Diego School of Medicine study found that people who were more grateful actually had better heart health, specifically less inflammation and healthier heart rhythms. They showed a better well-being, a less depressed mood, less fatigue, and they slept better. Gratitude has the opposite effect of stress. Isn't that amazing? I don't know if you're at all like me, but there are seasons in which I forget that. And I forget to be grateful. It really is kind of an attitude that needs to be cultivated. In fact, as parents, we're really good at trying to teach our children to be grateful, to say thank you. But let's be honest, sometimes we forget that lesson as we get older. And so this lesson is not as much, maybe as much for kids as it is for us as adults, that we can get jaded and we forget what good things God has done for us. So here's what I want us to do as we kind of lean into this message this morning is I want to give you an opportunity just to kind of, from where you're at, you don't have to stand up, but as you come to this season of Thanksgiving, what are you thankful for over this past year? For family, yeah. What else? God's provision. God has, in fact, that's going to be a key part of the message today, God's regular provision for His people. What else? Employment, yeah. Yes, employment. Good thing is employment. Being able to pay bills, having a roof over our heads. What else? Your dog. Oh. Dogs are a good thing most of the time. So that's for grandma. Oh man, yeah, grandmas. For God's love. What? For Jesus. For our church. Come on. For snow? Yeah. You know, it was like just a little over a week ago, we were walking in Rockford, 70 degrees, which was great. And then a week later, this. So, but the beauty of Michigan and God, however. See, it's amazing how you look at it, because some people are cursing the skies and others are going, oh, bring it on. I love it. So a lot of it's perspective. What else? How has God maybe blessed you this year? What was that? Good health. Yeah. Retirement. Hey. I hear good things about that. Yeah. Yeah. Oh. The blessing of Social Security, yes. That God made everyone? Awesome. Good. Children, yeah, they are a blessing. For protection. Yeah. Been blessed with Levi and Amanda. And we're looking forward to Zach and Alethea being with us full time here in this next week or so. Well, there may be more, but I hope even as you hear that, you go, wow, I didn't think about it. And just in a matter of a few minutes, I kind of feel better about coming into church this morning. I wasn't sure I wanted to come into church. I thought it was going to be a snow day, you know, and here we are. So thanks and thanksgiving and thankfulness are really important. In fact, if you look in Scripture, particularly in the story of the Exodus, you'll see how key a role complaining plays in the story. In fact, later on in the New Testament, 1,500 years later, Paul will pick up on that and he'll say, remember how God's people complained in the wilderness and in the Exodus and what happened to them. Don't do that. We're to be thankful. We're to be grateful. Already up to this point in the story, the people of God complained before the Exodus. They complained when they got to the Red Sea. They complained when there wasn't water. And today, they're going to be complaining because there isn't any food to eat. And so I want you to take a look at the map here. This is kind of the region, Elam, and off to what's known as the Desert of Sin. Now, that isn't like a metaphor. It's not really sin is the word we think of. It's just the name of that area, but it's kind of appropriate. This is where they're going to be in the midst of our story today, and they're hungry. Their reserves, the things that they brought with them are now they're a month out and they're gone. And they're hungry. And so take a look at your insert. In fact, before I get to the text, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lead in with a point from your insert, and then we'll go to the passage itself. So what we're going to see, first of all, is this. We're going to see when a food crisis becomes a faith crisis. When a food crisis becomes a faith crisis. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 16, beginning in verse 1. It says, the whole Israelite community set out from Elim, and they came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. So 1 month after leaving Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. All right, so they've forgotten God at this point, and they're turning their attention to Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death. So the Israelites turn on Moses and Aaron, and they basically say, you guys did this on purpose. You brought us out here just so that we would die in the wilderness. But I want to go back over the last month and even before that. Hadn't God already brought plagues on Egypt done these amazing, miraculous things. Hadn't God already parted the Red Sea and delivered them and wiped out the army of Pharaoh and of Egypt? But now they're facing empty bellies. And they're sure they're going to die. They're sure it's all over. And here's the thing. Often it is the little things in life that can trip us up when faith meets daily needs. It's not just the Red Sea parting that we look to. We often, it's in the middle of the little things that we forget God. Kids, I want you to think about that. Have you ever had a day that simply fell apart because you couldn't find your favorite toy? Worst thing ever. Can't believe this would ever happen to me. Moms, you ever had that morning where you're already running late, you got to get the kids to school and get to work, and you can't find your keys? And it just seems like the worst thing ever. Dads, the U of M Ohio State game is coming on. You can't find the remote. And all of a sudden, this little ordeal seems so desperate. Like life as we know it might just be over. And so anger and frustration and maybe not so nice words come to our minds because of this little inconvenience. And if we can be honest for a second, some of us are professional complainers. Some of us are really good at it. The summer's too hot. The winter is too cold. Too much snow. Not enough sun. Some of us master at that. In fact, we're never quite satisfied. In fact, I believe that spiritually, a lot of us are like Goldilocks. Too hard, too soft, just right. Or too hot, too cold, just right. In fact, that's the way a lot of people choose churches. If I got this little bit that I like, I don't really like that bit. In fact, that kind of bugs me, so I'll move on to the next church. And I'm not saying that there isn't a process that goes when we make those decisions, but I've watched over the years as people, it doesn't take much for them to be upset about one thing or another, and they moved on to the next thing because their needs weren't being met. And so I want to go back to the story and just realize maybe when we read the story of the Israelites, we can have some sympathy. Because we go, you know what? If I was hungry out in the wilderness, I might complain too. We might go a little easier on them and realize we could still learn some lessons from them. One person put it like this. What happens with Egypt or with Israel is suddenly Egypt seemed all peaches and cream, or actually pots of meat and all you can eat, rather than bondage and slave drivers. See, the sad part is they've just been delivered from slavery, and not because they've got a little hunger, they would just as soon have died at God's hand in Egypt. Virginia Satter, who's a therapist, said most people prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty. We sometimes would rather be miserable with the things that we know and we're comfortable with than we are taking a risk and having to trust that God will show up in the uncertainty of the unknown. And I think back to being a kid. As kids, we want to grow up fast. We want freedom to stay up as late as we want and to eat all of the Twinkies and whatever we want, and nobody gets to tell us no. We get to make all of our own choices. And then here's what's going to happen, kids. One day that's going to come, and you're going to get the chance, and you're going to realize it's a whole lot harder than it looks. And here's what's going to happen. You're going to fall asleep one night, or before you fall off to sleep, and you go, I wish I was back home. Now, I'm not trying to compare living at home to slavery in Egypt. I'm just saying that sometimes the things that are actually a part of life, which are growing and maturing and taking and finding some freedom, actually are a little scarier than we realize. And we prefer the comfort of somebody setting our schedule for us. Well, here's what's going to happen in our passage today, is that God is going to use this experience to teach his people. And he's going to use, by extension, use that experience of Egypt, or Israel and Egypt's experience, to teach us too. So let's go on to the next movement in the story. When trust includes obedience. So when we have a food crisis, it becomes a faith crisis, the little things of life. Now God is going to use this to stretch them to realize that trust also includes obeying him. Look at verse 4. And then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. Now, it's interesting. God could have really gotten ticked with them again, just because they were complaining. But we don't see that here. I'm not saying that he isn't frustrated. Moses gets frustrated for sure. But God is going to use their cry to teach them. He says, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So God responds by saying, I'm going to meet your needs. But it's also going to be a test. And here's what he asks of them. Here's what you're to do. Each day, you're to go out and take enough for that day. And don't save anything. You're not to save it for the next day. You're just taking just what you need for that day. And what we're going to find out is that if they let it stay, it will actually go bad. He also says, and on the sixth day, you're to take twice as much. And then he basically says, trust me, it won't go bad. Now, why is he asking them to do that on the sixth day? Because God is weaving into their story the Sabbath. And the Sabbath goes all the way back to creation, that in 6 days God created, and on the seventh day God rested. He says that's the rhythm of life for humanity. He had created them with a need for rest. And so here's what happens. God then is teaching them about the Sabbath rest. Why is that? Because I want you to think about this. As slaves, they never got to rest. And in a working culture, people don't rest, especially slaves. So this is a gift from God. Not only the food to eat on a daily basis, but the gift of rest. You get to take a break. In fact, it's like God is teaching them that rest is good and it's his gift, and that God will run the universe while you and I take a nap. And that he doesn't need us to run the universe. And so part of that is teaching them to trust him on a regular basis. And trust here then is going to involve obedience. Trust is not merely passiveness and just kind of waiting and sitting back, though there are times where that is kind of the case. It's also following through in obedience. Faith, James says, without works is dead. Faith isn't just a mental exercise that says, yeah, I believe in God. James says even the demons believe in God and they shudder. That's not going to change their destiny. So faith includes obedience and following through on what God has called us to do. So the question then for Israel and for us is, does God truly have my back? Does God truly have my best interest in mind? That he would actually take care of my needs. And so that's what they're going to learn in the wilderness. And by extension, he's calling us to learn as well. And that this trust is going to include obedience. Third thing, the third movement in the story is when God takes it personally. So God does take their complaining personally. Let's go to verse 6. In fact, Moses and Aaron point out the fact that it's about God. And so Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? It's not us. It's God. Moses also said, you will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. And then Moses told Aaron, say to the Israelite community, come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. And through this passage, over and over again, they're grumbling. Moses is trying to make a very clear statement. You have got God's attention. Verse 10, and God is going to reveal himself. While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. Remember last week we talked about the fact that God's ultimate intention in delivering his people was not merely for their deliverance and not merely to prove a point, but was to show his glory, for him to be worshiped. Now that word glory is an interesting thing because it means splendor, it means honor, it can have to do with wealth and so forth. It can mean weightiness. But in this case, it can also mean really the presence of God and you'll notice in the Old Testament, particularly in Exodus, God shows up in fire and in clouds. And it's brilliance. There's almost a brightness to it. In other words, God has already told Moses that you as a man cannot see me as I really am and still live. And so I'll present myself in such a way as so you can encounter me and see how awesome I am without you dying in the process. Do you remember a time in the New Testament when there was a cloud involved and a kind of an amazing brightness? It was on the Mount of Transfiguration. When Jesus is there with Peter, James, and John, and they saw his glory. And a cloud descended, and there was Moses and Elijah, and he was so brilliant white. That was essentially saying the glory of God has shown up in Jesus. And you get to see God as he is in this sense and still live. And so here God is trying to call their attention to the fact, I'm here. It's me. It's not Moses and Aaron you're complaining about. It's ultimately about me. In verse 11, the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them at twilight, you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread, and then you will know that I am the Lord your God. I want you to think about this, because this is true in all of our lives. Has it ever occurred to you that your complaining and my complaining, whether we knew it or not, is actually directed toward God? That the complaining that we often do is really an affront to God. And I'm not saying it's ever bad to say, oh, the weather stinks today, or it's not the end of the world. But let's just think about it. I mean, who's in control of the weather? Or this isn't fair. Or I can't believe this happened to me or that happened to me. And again, God is more than able to take our broken hearts and our frustration. And I'm not saying don't bring those things to God. I'm just saying so often we complain about things to one another, but we don't bring it to God. It's almost like misdirected prayer. We take it to people who can't do anything about it rather than taking it to the very one who is in control. As Don Kistler put it, the person with a discontented heart has the attitude that everything he does for God is too much and everything God does for him is too little. Isn't that true? I can't believe God wants me to do this. And then I can't believe God didn't show up and do this for me. And let's just be honest, sometimes that can be all of our attitudes. And it's usually a misperception, a perspective that is often. In fact, one of the reasons we gather together on Sunday to worship is to be reminded of how off kilter we can get. Our scales get a little imbalanced, and we come to become balanced once again and realize who's in control and who it's all about. In fact, the interesting thing, he says a couple of times in this passage, but he wraps up, Moses does, by saying, then you will know, or that God does, then you will know that I am the Lord your God. Remember back in Egypt, God brought the plagues on the Egyptians so that they would know that he was the Lord. Same concept, same idea right here, and God is saying that for his people, and you will know that I am the Lord. And what's interesting here, it's not by all the plagues I've already done. It's not by the parting of the Red Sea, even though those will be parts of it. He's saying, the fact that I will feed you every day, you will know that I am the Lord. I think that's a profound thing. I want you to keep that in your mind, that maybe it's in the everyday stuff. Sometimes we're so wanting to see God on a mountaintop experience that we miss him in the everyday things, which leads to the next movement in the story. Number 4, when testing teaches us trust. God is going to use this testing to develop their trust in him. And so he fulfills what he says he's going to do. Look at verse 13. And then that evening, quail came and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" By the way, it says a little later in this passage, they called this manna because it basically means, what is it? It was kind of like, man, huh? I mean, they just weren't really sure what it was, and so it just kind of stuck. And so manna became the name for it, for they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent." I'm not sure exactly. The people have offered different ideas about exactly how much that is, but we're not exactly sure. We just know it was enough for each of them. In verse 17, the Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone gathered just as much as they needed. And then Moses said to them, "No one is to keep any of it until morning." So only enough for the day. However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning. But it was full of maggots and began to smell. And so Moses was angry with them. You see, God is going to use these tests to teach them, and by extension, us. But in this case, he doesn't punish them. And I think that's an important note, that even though God's people didn't pass the test fully, they learned a lesson. You see, sometimes we're afraid that if we don't pass the test, we're doomed. We're done. Now, there are some things for God's people which he draws a line and says, that's enough. But I want you to understand that not every test is a test in which if we don't pass it just right, that we're done. And for those of you who are perfectionists and A-only students, never satisfied with anything less, you probably need to hear this. That God's people will learn here that even when we fail, we can fail forward. We didn't trust him in this moment, but God didn't take us out, and he continued to provide. So I just want to say that to you because God is a God of grace, and there are going to be moments in each of our lives in which we stumble and fall and we get misdirected and we don't pass the test, so to speak. And yet God hasn't given up on us. If anything, he wants us to learn from that experience, to turn, to repent, to cry back out to him, in which God can say, now I can work with you. Now you've learned the lesson I wanted you to learn. You see, God wants to teach his people that he's not only the God who can part the sea, he's the God who provides daily for us. Terence Fredheim goes on to say that when we search for God only in the mountaintop experience, we miss his regular care in the ordinary things of life, and we may assume he's absent because he's not doing some miraculous, dramatic thing. By the way, there are some churches that kind of teach that you should be walking in the miraculously constantly. And I just want to say, that's nonsense. I'm not saying that God doesn't do miracles. I'm just saying that for those who believe that the only way God can show up is with some dramatic healing or some dramatic movement or experience. Actually, God shows up in your daily breakfast. And I don't mean a picture of Jesus on your toast. I mean that God shows up by providing. That God shows up by caring for us in the midst of the daily activities of life. And if we're not careful, we're constantly missing him for those things because we're looking for something more dramatic. God for Israel is setting up the dailiness and the habits of faith. I want to draw your attention to a prayer that Jesus taught his disciples. The Lord's Prayer, the Our Father. And you may know it, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And then what's he say next? Give us this day our monthly bread, our yearly bread. He says our daily bread. And I believe he's drawing back on this experience of Israel, that God doesn't want to just give us enough so that we're good for a while. He's saying, I want you to realize that faith is a daily experience. See, in America, we're not used to that because we really can, literally, and I'm not saying it's bad to get stuff for the winter and put it in your freezer, but there's a good portion of the world that literally goes from hand to mouth. They don't have refrigeration. They literally go to the market every single day to get what they need to get. And so they would understand some things that we often don't understand. And so I think the prayer is a good prayer for us to continue to keep in mind, to continue to pray, which is, God, give us what we need for today. Not just store me, get me set for the month and then I don't have to touch base with you for a while. But it's a regular rhythm and routine. So Jesus is drawing on that, but Jesus draws on another part of this passage. In fact, I want to draw your attention to Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, this is like at the end of the 40 years of the wilderness wandering. And Deuteronomy it actually means in Greek the second law. So Moses is kind of recapping. He's reminding them of where they've come from. And so he's retelling the story. And in chapter 8, verse 2, he says, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. So this is part of the testing, trying to know what's really in their hearts. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna. Pause here for a second. Do you realize that our very needs and appetites and desires and quite literally needs to survive are part of God's way of telling us that we need him? So the fact that we need food, we look to the giver of food. The fact that we need light, that we need warmth, that we need protection, that we need a house overhead is our way of looking to God, who is the provider. And so he goes on to say, he provided manna for you, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. He's trying to teach them in the daily habits of things that while, as Fredheim says, that while man doesn't live by bread alone, man cannot live without bread. So he needs bread, but it's a teaching moment. It's a lesson to say there's more than that. It's not the bread, it's the one who gives it to you. Do you think it's by accident then that Jesus, after his baptism, is led into the wilderness? For how long? 40 days, maybe comparable to the 40 years. And where Israel is tested in the wilderness and they don't do so hot, Jesus is going to be the true Israelite who is tested in his wilderness experience, and he's going to come out pure. And in this case, in Matthew chapter 4, verse 1, Jesus is led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. And the tempter came to him and said, if you are the Son of God. Now, by the way, the way that's written is not the devil saying, I'm not really sure you are. It's actually written in a way to say, you're the Son of God. I know you're the Son of God. Therefore, if you're really the Son of God, go ahead and tell these stones to become bread. You've got the power. And look what Jesus says. He quotes Deuteronomy. It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. In other words, Jesus is fulfilling that perfectly. And what he's saying is that while God is teaching us in the daily habits of life that we need to look to him for food and for our needs and for our bills to be paid and all those things, that at the end of the day, what we need is not food and our bills to be paid. What we need is God. What we need is experience with God. What we need is the Word of God. Now, what's interesting, if you read through the rest of this passage, and we won't back in Deuteronomy or in Exodus 16, this is such a significant thing that eventually Moses has Aaron take some of the manna and put it in a jar and put it eventually in the Ark of the Covenant, which is the representation of the presence of God in their midst. And it would be preserved for generations down the road to remember just how God provided for his people with bread on a daily basis. And they ate it all the way up to the border of Canaan. God was teaching them in that moment. Well, let's go to this last couple set of slides. I just want to reflect real quickly these last 4 points. Here's what God is teaching his people, and by that I mean us too. He's saying this: I know what you need. I think that's important for us to reflect on. Sometimes we're not sure God knows what we need. Now, I'm not saying we need to tell him as well. I think it's important for us to cry out to him. But sometimes we're not sure. Second of all is, I will provide what you need. Cry out to me, I'll provide. Thirdly, I ask you to trust me. This is a trust test. This is, will God really show up in our daily lives? And then lastly, I want you to know, and this is key, that I am more important than food. See, at the end of the day, God isn't as interested that you get what's in his hand, but that you get him. Not just the miracle that we cry out for, but the one who does the miracles. Which leads to the very last point here, is that Jesus is ultimately the bread from heaven that we all need to live. Did you know that what Jesus does is he'll take all of these stories and he will fulfill them. He'll draw them to their ultimate point. That's why Jesus does communion at Passover. That's why Jesus feeds the 5,000. Think about that for a moment. Why would Jesus feed the 5,000? As a way of saying, the great king, the provider of all, has shown up in your midst and he can provide your needs. But in John chapter 6, what's interesting is Jesus ends up across the lake. He's walking on the water. He ends up with his disciples. And then the word gets back to everybody else who was at the feeding of the 5,000, and they make their way to find him on the other side. And the problem is, what they want more food. This guy's pretty good. I mean, he just fed us. If we hang out with this guy, we're going to get all of the food and meat that we ever will need. But then the religious leaders come to him and say, give us a sign that shows us that you have the right to be doing these things. I think, well, he just fed 5,000, and that kind of sign enough. But then they say, well, Moses fed our people 40 years in the wilderness with manna. What are you going to do? And then he corrects him. He said, it really wasn't Moses that did that. It was my father that did that. But then he draws it to an important point. John 6:35, Jesus replied, essentially, it's not manna you need me. I'm the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry again. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. Jesus is taking the example of the Israelites who were trying to figure out this trust in God, and he's saying it's come to its fulfillment in me, that what you ultimately need is not food and water, what you need is me. And when you've got me, you'll get the food and the water that you need. But when you get me, you'll have a spiritual satisfaction and fullness that you could never experience outside of me. So is it possible that the trial that you're going through, the struggle, maybe it's a financial one, maybe it's a health one, maybe it's an emotional, relational issue, that God actually wants to use that daily struggle, that daily cry for food, as a way of saying, do you trust me? Is it me that you need, or is it just your belly that you need full? Is it me that you want, or is it something from me that you want? Well, communion is our regular reminder that it's not about food, even though what's interesting is communion is a meal. It was instituted in a meal. But that's where Jesus says it's not about the bread and the wine. It's about me. This is my body. This is my blood spilled for you. This points to me. Because at the end of the day, you could be full and not be saved. Or you could be starving and crying out to me and find the fullness that you ultimately need. And so this morning, we want to come to feed on the bread of life. If you're a Christian, you don't have to be a member here, but if you're a Christian, you're welcome to partake with us It's our weekly reminder of who we are and whose we are. That we are children of God. We have the bread of life, the hope of all the world. After I pray, you're welcome to go to where the communion trays are and get those cups, and then bring them back to your seat and spend some time with Jesus. Let's pray. Jesus, as we come to you this morning, we thank you that you came to fulfill all of the hopes and the wishes and the dreams and the needs, ultimately, really, of Israel. But not only of Israel, of the whole world. That we have a hunger, a deep spiritual hunger that goes well beyond our food, well beyond our wealth, well beyond our titles. We need you. And so we come this morning not just for a healing, not just for provision, though we bring those to you as well. We come because we want to meet with you. And we ask that in this time that we would experience your presence and that we would go from this place today carrying a sense of your presence with us so that when others encounter us, they will sense your presence as well. It's in your name we pray. Amen.